Welcome to the Nexus Project, a contemporary marketing conversation with John Ghiorso.
Welcome everybody to the first episode of the Nexus Project. So this is a show and a project really that is exploring the intersection of contemporary marketing and emerging technology. So on this episode, I interview Lewis Smithingham. Lewis is the SVP of Innovation at Media.Monks. He has a really interesting career and story. He's a thought leader across a bunch of different domains: virtual worlds, gaming, VR, AR, Metaverse, and many more. A quick couple notes on Lewis's bio. So he is a Guinness World Record holder. He's been profiled in the New York Times, featured on CNBC, Business Insider, Ad Age, Fast Company, and many more. And we get into a wide-ranging conversation that for me was almost all new information. So I think it's going to be really entertaining and informative. We get into the kind of, I would say, realistic view of the metaverse and what it is and isn't, and how people can actually take advantage of it today. We talk about virtual worlds. We talk about gaming. We, of course, talk about Apple's new headset and some commerce questions as well. So I think you're going to enjoy it. Without further delay, here we go. Lewis, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really, really excited. I'm Lewis Smithingham, SVP of Innovation for Media.Monks. Super stoked to be here.
Awesome. So Lewis, let's dive right into it. You and I talked, obviously talked before the show and other times, and we've talked about kind of our mutual dislike, I would say, for the term metaverse. In my opinion, it's theoretical, it's vague. You ask 10 out of 10 people how to define it, you'll get 10 different answers almost every time. So that being said, it does represent an important trend or series of trends. What's your term? How do you think about this concept overall?
I again, as somebody who has worked in some facet of the metaverse, depending upon how one defines it, for the larger bulk of my professional life, I have a love-hate relationship with that term. I personally feel that it is sci-fi. Like, it's literally coined by a sci-fi writer. And while I do think at some point in time, some version of the metaverse will exist, I think that it sets expectations poorly. And I'm somebody who believes that technology only matters when it feels inevitable. And arguably when it feels somewhat banal is when it actually matters. And I think when we get to the stage of the metaverse, we won't be sitting around being like, oh, well, we're in the metaverse now. It'll just be like, cool, see you in VR tonight. Okay, cool. And you probably won't even say that because it will probably be so normal. Like, I said the word, I'll call you on my cell phone earlier today, and I felt weird. I don't know, why didn't I just say phone?
Yeah.
I think,
if you send a Slack, you don't say, hey, I sent you an internet communication. Would you like to respond? Right?
No, you don't. Like, unless you're in prison, I guess. To that end, the term that I tend to use most for this massive trend that we've been undergoing for probably the better part of 2 decades is a shift towards virtualization. It's mostly around the idea that the way we engage with our world, with our culture, frankly, with everything, is shifting in a couple different ways to a space where it's more virtualized. Where our interfaces with digital are ceasing to be in 16:9 boxes and are starting to be in 3D space, in Z space. I think particularly with younger generations in particular, myself included, how we game, where we game, who we hang out with when we game is such a major part of our culture. Like, I spend something like 2 hours, 3 hours a night playing Fortnite with my friends. And I'm not like, what's up, guys? See you in the virtual world tonight. And it's interesting, like my wife and I were actually talking about it, where like she thinks of that time that I spend with my friends in the same way as she thinks of when my friends come over. Like, I'm just hanging out with my friends. Now, another major characteristic of this whole shift is this shift to cloud, the shift to the way in which we're engaging is our devices are becoming more connected virtually and physically throughout all of our lives. And I think the pandemic took a trend that was already happening, but probably poured gasoline on the fire. Well, not probably, absolutely poured gasoline on the fire. And we saw these, remember the early days, I was still living in Brooklyn, the early days of the pandemic, and where YouTube was going down because there was so much traffic flooding in to the network at that time. And it was that period of time has caused us to harden our networks. It's also caused us to realize that access to network is a basic human right. And to that very end, access as capital and the way we engage shifts more and more virtual. It's, it's a massive aspect of our lives. So I tend to use, to answer that question in a less long-winded way, I tend to think of, avoid saying the word metaverse directly, not because I dislike the metaverse, but because I dislike the jingoism that's come along with the metaverse. It's sort of like, I don't like telling people I like Green Day, but I adore Dookie. It's an incredible record. But if I say I like Green Day, people are like, oh, yeah, okay, poser. And so I guess the term I tend to use is virtualization.
Okay.
And it's this idea that we're shifting to that space.
I like it. And, you mentioned Fortnite, which obviously you're playing on a 2D screen.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, and
for now,
right? So, okay. So, we're recording this a week after Apple's big event where they launched their headset. Spatial computing is kind of their term for it. How important is that moment in terms of the overall culture? I mean, Apple has an ability to create these cultural moments that few other companies do. And then kind of a part two of that is in this virtualization trend, which largely right now today is, I believe, happening on 2D screens for the most part. When you look at the platforms, how important though is AR, VR, XR, like walking into a 3D spatial computing, whatever you want to call it, world?
Yeah, I mean, the other term I do tend to use, spatial web. The idea that it's just like, and spatial compute is obviously a part of the spatial web. It's so how important is that moment as it relates to Apple bringing in? Well, I mean, Apple has been sitting in VR in some way, shape, or form since the late 90s, depending upon one's definition of what VR is. If you remember QuickTime VR back in the day, do you remember QuickTime VR?
No, I didn't even know that.
QuickTime VR was sick.
For what use? Like
car tours, car interior tours.
Okay.
Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, if you wanted to click on a website and look at the interior of the car, you had to launch a player called QuickTime VR Player, where there were panos. It was 360 panos taken of the car's interiors. And there was a stereo version at one point in time in QuickTime 7. It's dating myself and also giving myself a little bit of nerd credentials. But so Apple has been a part of this since the way early days. I would argue depending upon how one defines what VR is, like we could be talking about cave paintings to a certain extent, but the modern iterations of post-Murder, She Wrote iterations of VR, which if you do have graphics in this, there's a great graphic of Angela Lansbury wearing a VR headset.
Okay.
It's an amazing moment. That and
for sure.
Yardwork Simulator are the two greatest moments in VR prior to the late 90s. Yardwork Simulator being in The Simpsons. Anyway, point is, Apple's been in since day one, but they've been planning their moves really, really slowly. You start looking at directly in the early, I think it's like 2015, 2016, which is the first time I really seriously got involved. I'd been in bullet time beforehand. But I joined a VR company as a partner, a company called 30 Ninjas, in that first or second or third, whatever you want to call it, third renaissance of VR, which was kicked off
this moment, right?
Yeah, with Palmer kicking off the DK1, which was rad and wild. And I remember the Wild West days, a company called Next VR that Apple acquired, I believe in 2017. It might have been 18. So the point there is that like Apple has been sitting in this space, working quietly and taking the best parts of their technology and slowly integrating them. And what Apple does really, really well is they take technology that they've been engaging with for a while and slowly but surely form it to the point where they become eponymous as it relates to it. You know,
Mhm.
Apple's not the first cell phone. Apple's not the first, like you watch those keynotes and like they're not the first to release all of these, almost all of these features, but they're the first people to do it in a coherent, cohesive, clean, exactive way. I think one exception of that is spatial audio. Apple is a long-term champion of spatial audio when others straight up abandoned and deprecated those apps. I'm not going to name the names of the blue chip companies, but like
Hmm.
every major one of those FANG companies had a spatial audio division that they slowly but surely let go. Apple stuck around with it. And the AirPod Pros specifically, are one of two consumer devices. LG makes the other one that has the Dolby Atmos license, the 9.1 license. And I mean, they're incredible as a
Yeah.
device. And as a spatial device, they're like the head tracking in that in the AirPod Pros is absolutely spectacular. The only thing that comes close is the LG T90s, which are also awesome but undersung. But I guess the point I'm making there is so Apple's building these things in and they launch this headset. It has spatial. Apple has some of the best display technology in the world. They're one of two companies to receive ACES certifications. ACES is the Academy of Motion Pictures. So it's the people who do the Oscars. They like to view a display, it has to be ACES certified. There's LG OLEDs that have that, and Apple's displays, the Retina displays, and their micro OLEDs. So they're taking all these pieces of technology that exist, but putting them in a very coherent, clean, clear manner
Yeah.
and putting them in a device that I love the external battery pack. Like it's saying like it's acknowledging its shortcomings, but at the same time, it's basically saying this device is here. This is how it will work. And so, in terms of how this will direct culture, I think if anything, this just specifically identifies that the trajectory of the Gartner hype cycle that we have been on is turning directions right now. And for me, it's very affirming
Yeah.
to see, okay, this hype cycle is turning
Yeah.
directly how we expected to. And like, again, I'm not saying that like every single person is going to be wearing a VR headset this time next year. I will say that the Oculus Quest 2 has sold as many headsets and it has as many active users as the GameCube had in its heyday.
Interesting.
So it's a successful console, small scale. But I guess the point I'm making is we are in this upward trajectory in our shift. And as devices inevitably get smaller, as Rel 18 Plus comes out next year and our connectivity to cloud gets faster, that was something that I found notably absent was discussions of communication and how that headset will connect to the cloud or to whatever compute it's with. I thought that was really interesting. And that says to me that there's probably something really exciting to come
Hmm.
from that. But I guess the point I'm making is I think this shows that we're turning directions, like the curve, we're coming
Yeah.
out of, I think it's called
The trough of
yeah,
disillusionment.
the trough of
Yeah.
disillusion and out
Yeah.
of the fucking hills of sorrows
Yeah.
and up into like normalization. And like, yeah,
Yeah.
in 5 years' time, it will probably not be a conversation point to be like, hey, we'll put on our headset, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like, I think that's where we're walking towards is that moment of just it will work and it
Yeah.
will be fine and it
Yeah.
won't be fussy.
I That's a great point. I think, when people think about the Gartner hype cycle, which I just love, I think it applies to so many different domains, but they tend to picture the hype cycle itself, but what they forget about is that the other part of that graph is the actual technological progress, which is a fairly kind of linear, normal.
Yeah, when it stops to suck moment is basically what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And then eventually those two curves match up. And I
Yeah.
do feel like, well, we've had the overhyped stuff that happened with the metaverse 18 months ago. We've had the trough of disillusionment where you have all these articles coming out saying this was never going to work. It's totally dead. And then Apple kind of says, no, it's not. Here you go. And it does feel like, okay, now the future looks more predictable, maybe is a way of saying it. It's not going to change everything next year, but it's not also a dud. It's somewhere in the middle, which is typically how.
I mean, I tend to think like, and you see hype cycles happen so fast in our industry. We're like literally a large portion of my job is to be plugged into hype cycles.
Yeah.
And to be directly a part of that. I think this particular cycle I have lived in for longer than I ever thought I would, but it's something I'm deeply passionate about. But I think I almost would argue that like it's not so much confirming predictions, but confirming trajectory. Like what is the next beat? We'll know the actual angle of this hype cycle. And granted, depending upon some advances in GPU in the next 8 months, like I do think we'll probably start to see something that's physically fun to use.
Yeah.
And that's not saying headsets aren't fun to use.
But that gets a little bit more kind of the downsides are reduced. Because I think right now it's, I'm a casual fan of VR, but even for me, there's some real physical downside to.
Oh, dude, in 2015, when I got my Guinness record for VR, I spent 7-8 months of my life with a vomit bag underneath my desk that I used 2 to 3 times a day because the director that I was partnered with, like we were trying to figure out like how to feel emotion in VR, how to tell stories. And this director's theory in part was, well, nausea is an emotion, right? So let's see what happens. But again, like there were downsides, but frame rate predictably went up. We were hitting frame rates of, I think it was like 30, 40 hertz back then on the DK1, the DK2. And like I was blown away by the hand tracking and Leap Motion, and now we're getting into spaces where like hand tracking is just a foregone conclusion. Of course it's there. Like, of course that's happening. And you're getting into these spaces where retinal tracking is not like, oh my whiz bang. I remember seeing retinal tracking. The folks at Nokia Ozo, RIP, took me over to see it at, I believe it was SIGGRAPH 2017. And like, everyone's just like, dude, have you seen eye tracking?
Yeah.
It's a company called Tobii, I think it was TOBII. And everyone's just blown away. And all these things are packed in this little device. It's very easy. It's very normal.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it becomes 9 out of 10 users won't even know that's there. They won't think about it. It's just going to work. And that's kind of when you get to
you don't need, like Samsung had this product. It was awesome. It totally worked. So part of the theory of why you have simulator sickness is when you travel through the world, wind or air pressure differences hit the little hairs in your ear. I think it's not cilia, that's in your stomach, but whatever the thing is in your ear. And they designed these micro headphones that had spatial audio in them, binaurals in them, that had fans plugged in as well that would correspond to the accelerometer signals to stimulate your ears.
So just to zoom out on that, because
that's how different the world is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I do think that just the adoption of headsets in general as like something that you put on, you don't think about, maybe you take on and off, maybe you leave on for 4 hours. The physical discomfort, which is on a few different planes. There's the actual weight of the thing. There's the eye strain. There's the motion sickness. Those genuinely do have to be solved. Like,
and they're being solved. That's easy.
You think short answer to that is that's going to get solved. It will happen. You're not worried.
But how are they solving? Like, and this is like as a vain person who's obsessed with my hair, how are they going to fix the fact that when I put a headset on, I get headset hair? Like that's only going to be solved by weight and reduction in physical size and physical force. And that's what will be part of it. Or perhaps it'll be normal to have that in.
Yeah. Okay. That's cool. So then, So back to kind of the overall virtualization conversation in general.
Yeah.
Today, um, what are the most scaled use cases? Is it basically these virtual worlds slash kind of gaming platforms, Roblox, Fortnite, etc., or are there others that are less obvious
For
that
VR, are you thinking, or just for the
just
virtual?
zoom out, so 2D
Oh,
screens,
digital
like
twin
just the
systems.
virtualization
Digital
concept.
twin systems. Bluntly, digital twin systems are the single most important technology
So
there
give
is
me
right now.
give me an example of that.
Yeah, sure. So, like, I mean, and Matthew Ball has a great article on this. Amazing investor, and it. So, digital twin systems, where this gets interesting, and obviously, this is part of the Gartner hype cycle as well. Is, you know, it goes out of the like cool, flashy, let's do a VR use case into like, okay, now Boeing wants to use it.
Okay, so
Okay,
more
we're
B2B,
doing
kind of
trainers.
industrial, those types of
I
applications,
mean, the idea that you can take your factory, create a full digital twin system of your factory, and interact with it
and just start
direct.
moving stuff around, move this, you know, yeah, okay,
Or
got
I saw like, so I was at Infocom yesterday, which is like a trade show for AV. There's a lot of stuff for first responders and police. And there was a company called Headwall VR there who is owned by an engineer friend of mine, which that is owned by an engineer friend of mine. And it what it does is it creates complete control rooms in a headset for a person. And like a control room, I mean like NASA mission control type thing.
yeah,
And I'm also watching For All Mankind right now, which great
yeah,
series.
great show, yeah,
And like there's all these shots of this control room which looks so insanely unwieldy. Like
yeah,
it's insane. And I have friends at Mission Control, and I've seen and toured those spaces, and the idea that you could take those and make them mobile, but also when you start talking about like incidents and responses to
yeah,
incidents, the idea that like you can create, instead of having this absurdist monitor wall facility that has to travel, the idea that people can connect directly and see multiple feeds and
that's really
participate and
interesting.
engage and work together in those spaces.
Yeah,
Those are spaces where the adoption curve, we're out of the hype cycle and
that,
people are just using them.
yeah,
Like
that's really interesting. That's
the
really,
idea that like, you're not, and particularly for situations where we're putting people in harm's way,
yeah,
that's where like VR and all this stuff is just like, yeah, it's done,
yeah,
cool, move
got
on. And I think as we start to get to those systems where look at, I mean, and this is like any technology follows a cycle, like the internet, phones, all these sort of things, everything first goes into these industrial applications, then starts to bubble up because those are the places that can also afford, like the best headset on the market right now is a headset called the Varjo. I always pronounce it correctly because I don't know how to pronounce Finnish. Varjo. It's a $7,800 headset. It's absolutely spectacular. It's
yeah,
unbelievable. It's perfect, but it's $7,800. The sort of people that can afford it are either the highest of the highest tier gaming users, um, or it's people who it like literally their lives or the lives of others
sure, yeah,
depend upon that, or
yeah,
building out large scale factories. That's where
interesting,
VR and digital twin systems are already happening. And you look at something like Microsoft Flight Simulator, where it's so obvious how that plays together and that virtualization plays together. That's where like that's where we're sort of clicking towards right now.
that
I
makes
mean,
sense.
BMW has their entire factory in a digital twin. Sorry,
Yeah,
go
and
ahead.
that's also where cost becomes obviously a totally sure it's still a
Yep.
factor, but on a very different scale. I mean, obviously an $8,000 piece of equipment is a non-issue for a
Plus
business,
the $8,000 computer you need to run it.
sure, but a big deal for a individual, hobby.
Yep.
So that makes a lot of sense. Back to the kind of on the consumer side of the virtualization trend. I'm avoiding the term metaverse here, even though that'll probably be the title of the
You
episode.
can say it. I mean, it is
Yeah.
like,
Well, the problem I have with the term, frankly, is I think my kind of version of it. I think the real version is something that just won't exist for years. So to
or won't ever exist, because like I'll remind you that RoboCop was set, I think, this year.
yeah,
And like,
flying
when was Back
cars.
to the Future? Last year? Where's my
Sure.
hoverboard?
Yeah. Sure. Fair enough. So anyway, on the consumer, virtual worlds, virtualization, whatever you want to call it, um, there's a lot of really cool experiential
Yeah.
stuff. Um, What about performance? Is there anything that's performance driven, or is
I
it
mean,
just
if you're talking like entertainment, it's the use case is there. And the thing we have to like, we can't neglect the fact that like when you go into VR, you go into Horizon Worlds, you go into, I mean, I used to go into VR chat all the time. Um, when you go into those spaces, it's awesome. It is like hanging out with a person. The first time I met Sir Martin during the pandemic was in a Horizon or was in a Meta workrooms, so the virtual offices. And every time I'd interact with that man prior to that point had been over Zoom calls where we don't
yeah,
have eye contact,
yeah.
where like people are looking at other screens. And I get in this room and I do a presentation and Sir Martin starts asking me questions and he's like this. And it was terrifying.
I was going to say that would be
And
intimidating.
you can see
Sure.
like you could see his hand gestures and you could see his presence. And there's a wonderful thing when you do those things. And when you're in VR or when you're, gaming with your friends where we're not looking at our phones. We're not looking at Slack. We're not
Yeah,
looking at
good point.
email alerts.
Yeah,
We're participating and we're interacting together in the same way I wouldn't have, but other people might have played golf together in the past.
yeah,
When you get to concerts and sports, it's even better. There's this amazing moment that happens now, and it's only happened in the last, I think, year. Prior to now, every time I put a headset on somebody, I would have to apologize. I'd be like, hey, let me know if you get sick.
yeah,
I know it looks a little blurry, but the technology's not there yet.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
just bear in mind. And he would do that shit where like my wife watches my work and is like, oh, it's great. But you're clearly just not
But
paying
it's a
attention.
demo, right? It's a demo at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Like, imagine
now,
what this would be like if it was better and if it.
I put on Post Malone's 12 Karat Toothache on you and you love it. Like people sit for 45 minutes watching that concert and they hang out and they sing and they dance and they talk to their friends. No, when you go into those rooms, nobody's in there talking about like, oh, the VR, it's so cool. Like, look at the thing.
They're just there, right?
They're just there
yeah,
watching a show,
yeah,
engaging with a performance. And that's where, like, to your point, the other use case is just like, it's done.
yeah.
Like we're there. It's great.
Cool.
People enjoy it. And like, oh man, like if I'd watched that cup final the other night in VR, it would have been absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
Like that level of emotive space you don't get from linear anymore.
So as I think you and I both agree that there's going to be an inevitable shift of just amount of people and amount of time spent in virtual spaces, let's just say.
Mm-hmm.
How is advertising going to happen, function, work? Is it? I mean, is there a use case for paid media inside of a virtual?
I have a very contrarian view here. That, like, I don't think advertising should exist. And I know that sounds like I'm killing my own job, but in the sense that, like, when I think of the word advertising, it feels intrusive and inauthentic.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
And like where it's just like, cool, it's a button where's the skip button?
Yeah.
Shit, I can't. Oh my God, I have to pay for like I recently paid for YouTube Premium, and I think it's one of the best decisions I've made in my life.
I have it too. It's great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. Because we're skipping over our own work. But where advertising and where brands have the opportunity is authentic interaction.
Yeah.
I'm playing like right now when I'm playing the new season, I'm playing as I'm wearing a Wu-Tang Clan skin. I have a Metallica avatar that's awesome. Or not Metallica emote.
Yeah.
Plays Master Puppets. Awesome. And I'm wearing shoes that are clearly supposed to be Jordans, but are not Jordans. Like they're like Nukes, not Nikes, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And like as a sneakerhead, I would absolutely pay way too much money
for the
to be able to wear a pair of breads.
Yeah.
In that. And so the opportunity for brands, and this is where shit gets really exciting. When we talk to brands and we're creating immersive experiences and we're creating interactive experiences, we get out of this concept of impressions and into this concept of UGE, the idea of user generated engagement. The idea that, sure, like I've done campaigns where 3 billion impressions or something stupid. And there's no way that's a real number also, because when you start thinking like, you're not hitting 3 billion people because 3 billion people don't have access to a phone.
Yeah, sure.
Well, they do now, actually, but like you get my point. Like it's meaningless. And like as a person who gives impressions, like just because I flicked by it does not mean it retained any information.
Yeah.
But when we engage with people in these virtual spaces, we are able to say like, hey, somebody interacted with your brand, your product, your toy, your car for hours or honestly years. You look at like the opportunities in a game like Rocket League for a car manufacturer,
or you're just looking at that car for literally hours and hours and hours.
And what's great as well is we have head tracking data. We did campaigns at my old company back in the day using a software where we would track the data where people are panning, and I could say in an experience they looked at your logo, soft drink manufacturer, for this many minutes. If we move your logo here, you'll get better usage from it. And that opportunity is where brands stop getting out of advertising, or start getting out of advertising and start getting into like, it's this new form of product placement where it's really just like, how does your brand show up with meaning? And I don't know if I talked to you about, have we talked about Chex Quest yet?
We did in a previous, offline, but yeah.
So I just ordered, there's a store down here that it's like Retro Games, and they repackage games. And I just bought a new CD-ROM for Chex Quest.
So, explain to the listeners.
Okay, so Chex Quest,
because I think it's a really interesting, like,
and this relates back to the whole story. So in the 90s, I'm kid 7, 8, 9, and all I wanted to do in the world was play Doom. All the cool older kids are playing Doom. And it was sick, but I was definitely not allowed to do it. Definitely not appropriate. And at the time, some insane person, bless them, at General Mills went to John Carmack, who later on went on to work at Meta with Oculus, directly overseeing that project. He's no longer there. We've had like the opportunity to work with him, which is, as a nerd, is very cool. They went to John Carmack and Joe Romero, makers of Doom, and said, hey, can we license Doom? And they're like, yeah, weird, whatever.
Yeah.
And so Chex cereal, which is, I don't know if you've had Chex cereal. Chex Mix is amazing, but Chex cereal is like, it's a cereal. Like, it's good, but like, it's not, you don't hear like guitar solos when you think of Chex Solo.
Yeah.
Chex cereal. And so they reskinned the entirety of Doom. It was Doom 2 as Chex, like Chex walls, and like there were
and the blood and
and there's no violence about it. You're now like a Chex cereal thing shooting milk at boogers or something. Yeah. And they put it in 100,000 cereal packages in the United States. And that correlated within 3 months to a more than 300% increase in the sale of Chex cereal.
Yeah.
I hunted that CD-ROM down, and probably spent 6 hours a night playing it. Like I'd wait for my parents to go to bed, sneak out and play it, and would play it as soon as I got home from school. And it's burned into my mind.
I don't care how many ads on Nickelodeon or whatever.
I don't remember any of them.
Ships that Chex could have done. Basically, I mean, that was an entire, probably not even year, decade worth of all the rest of the paid media combined.
It is burned in such a way.
Because you can't even measure it that way in terms of like the human experience you had with that brand.
Oh, dude, this is like some sort of like how cave people must think of like monoliths and stuff. Like I had Chex Mix yesterday when I was in Florida for dinner because I got in late, and like I bought Chex Mix and my brain goes, Chex Mix, Chex Quest. Love Chex Quest.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
This is like 25 years
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
What's going on? And that like is where this opportunity to participate in culture, to participate directly in that sort of storytelling and in meaning in people's lives, that's where brands have this opportunity for absurd success in
Yeah.
these spaces
I, you
and
know,
transcendental like
yeah.
success.
I I want to circle back to one thing, and you already
Yeah.
mentioned it, but I think there's a perception when it comes to these sort of virtual experiences and use cases that they can be fluffy, right? That it's okay, it's cool and it looks cool, and we did a store, but we don't really like what did it do? That we don't really know. There's not data, there's not attribution, there's not et cetera. But you mentioned this acronym, is it UGI? Is that right?
Yeah, UGE, user generated engagement.
So talk a little bit about that. Is that a single metric? Is it multiple KPIs that you're kind of grouping under this concept? Like what is
It's
actual, how do you really demonstrate success?
It's multiple KPIs, and I don't have the TLAs mapped for this because this is a talking point I am working on. But it's this idea that when you create engagement and when you create interactivity, and we run it like when we run our shows on Twitch or on YouTube or TikTok, we run interactive polling, and it you start looking at your rate of interactions per minute, whether that's commenting, whether that's responding to polls, almost like to a certain degree with a live show, you run it like a echocardiogram. Like, is the audience alive? Is anybody
Yeah.
actually paying attention? A lot of content right now is streamed on a second screen, and so like when you're playing a game or when you're watching sports, like chances are you're playing a game at this. I think it's like 67% of people who are watching sports are playing a game and eating at the same time. And so the first metric is just straight up engaging. And
Like,
you start getting into, depending upon what, and this sounds so insane, what dimension you are dealing with, what dimensions you're dealing with, you start looking at, okay, how many times is a person touching their phone when they're engaging? How many of those touches then result in some form of conversion, whether it's a click through, whether it's a purchase, whether it's an interaction or a power up? And then you start looking in this 3D map of like, okay, where are people actually looking? What are they engaging with? And you start getting into responsive game design, and you start realizing, I think people underestimate. There's this trend right now that that's starting to die where I think a lot of advertisers and brands think about people as demographics rather than identities. And it's this sort of theory that, so I live in North Carolina. I'm a straight white dude that lives in North Carolina, and the advertising set that my demographic set is trucks. And it's not me. I'm a dorky metalhead gamer dude that doesn't even know how to drive. Like, why are you advertising trucks to me? Rather than looking at the vast swath of personality I have. So you get to this thing. Okay, so there's CPI, cost per impression.
yep.
There's LPI, which is length per impression. So that's the amount of time. And these are TLAs that I made up. So somebody in the comments will probably say, like, nah, dude, that's actually something else. Sorry. Engagement per impression. So engagement is intention. So if you have a million or a billion impressions, how many of those people, discrete individual users, are actually interacting? Because that gives you an idea of engagement. And as you start to get to engagements per minute rate, or even you can get down to like engagement per seconds rate, you have an idea of who's actually paying attention to what you're doing. And you start looking at, as you're working in virtual worlds, the opportunity gets to look at, okay, are people just standing still? What are they interacting with? Look, if you're launching a product, what products are they engaging with? If you're Logitech, which we did a great world in Roblox for Logitech, what Logitech products in that world are they interacting with, and how are they interacting with? And as you start to go down those different types of KPIs, you get a much more clean metric of what a person wants and what they're engaging with, rather than just like, yeah, a lot of people saw our campaign on TikTok.
Yeah. That's great. Okay. So long story short, and this is probably an entire episode to be
Yeah.
honest, just to get into that topic, but it is much more measurable and definable than I think maybe frankly my perception. even prior to
It's
this.
three-dimensional. That's the thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot there to measure. I mean, because you're kind of all this is in virtual space, so it's being captured.
I mean, keep
Okay.
in mind, virtual spaces are inherently opt-in spaces as
Yeah.
well, right?
Yeah. Because they're walled gardens, right? Like at least, well,
A
they
lot
all.
of them are, and as they like again, they're a part where you're expressing your identity. So when I play Fortnite, they know of the hundreds of, not hundreds of thousands, but probably the $10,000 I've spent buying stuff in Fortnite. They know what I'm buying.
Yeah.
And so when I'm in a branded space and that sort of space, they're going to, or when I'm in Horizon Worlds, which I have bought all of the most expensive outfits in Horizon Worlds to flex on clients with, which has not paid off because nobody's been like, oh, I see you're wearing Tom Ford, Lewis.
Yeah. Like they don't know. Yeah. That's funny.
But
A little early, maybe.
I am wearing Tom Ford in
Yeah.
Horizon Worlds, not in real life, but in
Yeah.
Horizon Worlds. Like that swath of data is there. And it's tracked in a way, and this sounds, look, in real life, I do have an accelerometer on my wrist at all times almost, but that's certainly not shared. I hope not, or maybe it is with the advertiser. But it's shared in these spaces, and so you have where else do you have three-dimensional information on a participant in your, and an audience person?
Got it. That makes sense. I'm a commerce guy, so I have to ask the commerce question.
Commerce or Converse, just for clarity?
Commerce, like digital.
Commerce.
The cool name for what used to be e-commerce, right?
Okay.
So, okay. So, are there any? And it's okay if the answer is no, because it's still kind of early, and I feel like conducting commerce, purchasing a product, tends to be kind of the last thing that happens in a
Shouldn't be.
technological paradigm. Well, fair. So, where I'm going with this, are there any notable real world examples of virtual world plus purchasing physical product with some sort of scale behind it that you're aware of? Because frankly,
and there's stuff that isn't out yet that's coming in the near future that I can talk to, and you're hitting on a side obsession of mine, as well. So as you probably know, what like a good return rate for an e-commerce vendor in clothing is what, 37%? That's a good return rate. A good return rate.
Yeah.
And e-commerce runs on weird cycles that like aren't directly responsive to those return rates. You're filling factories full of stuff that people aren't buying, all that sort of stuff. There's a new trend that is metaverse driven, or virtual world driven. This idea that RGB or USD is the new RGB. So RGB, red, green, blue. USD is universal scene descriptor. So universal scene descriptor is a file type invented by Pixar that can basically take in almost any format, and it carries three-dimensional data to it. So the idea is right now, as brands shift, and this is a weird wormhole, but like if you start looking at how clothing is photographed and how like clothing is honestly rendered, it uses this absurdly antiquarian sort of system. It's called a Jacquard loom, which was actually one of the first computers in like 17 something. But there's this system now where we're starting to look at clothing physics being rendered at a better quality and at a better resolution. Snapchat just launched Project Aries, I think like last month or 2 months ago, that specifically looks at combining skeletal tracking with e-commerce in 3D. The idea that like when you look at a shoe, you take your shoes off, you can scan your feet and see the skeleton. Like basically it applies the skeleton. It's almost like in the 50s when you would go into a store and put your foot in an x-ray machine. It's sort of like that, but you're getting to this idea of try-on. And obviously virtual try-on has been around for a while, but it's not integrated fit because it hasn't integrated physics.
That's the problem with virtual try-on is you're just pasting an image of a product over the top.
Yeah, that sucks.
Doesn't really do anything. Yeah.
When you start shifting to a USD driven workflow, clothing has a couple factors: tensile strength, tensile strength, drape, and I believe there's like a third factor of stretch and fit. And so when those combine, those very, 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 very complex physics pieces combine, you get to what fit should be and how that works. And then you combine that with skeletal tracking. And there are a number of major manufacturers right now that are investing very heavily in scanning their clothing into very complex workflows to physically render clothing in 3D environments. Because then when you have your clothing rendered in 3D and you have all of your fabrics rendered as well, and there's a great company, swatchbook.io. I really am interested in how they create these like effectively giant 3D stock libraries of different fabrics that carry all the physics properties of fabrics.
So,
As you start to get to those, you start to get the idea that you could feed data into that workflow. Okay, Lewis's favorite colors are black, white, and red. Let's render all the clothes he sees right out of the gates in that. And let's look at, like, we know he wears this size, so let's render clothing in these things in fits that would fit him. And as you start to get to that, and there are a number of major brands working in that, that connection to virtual spaces and e-commerce gets pretty close pretty quickly. You look at some of the work we've done with Complex Con, where our conversion rates were crazy high for an interactive virtual world. As those connections between the virtual world and the physical world get stronger, and honestly, the physical world and e-commerce has such an amazing opportunity as we start shifting into a space where most e-commerce images, I would imagine, in the next year, maybe less, will be synthetically rendered. So
yeah,
using a synthetic production pipeline there's no actual product ever photographed. It's just completely rendered. And the environments in which they're rendered in, we've done this for a couple of major clients right now. All of that's going to be 3D in a game engine. Well, now it already exists in a game engine. So if you're already rendering your shoes, your car, your
yeah,
computer in a game engine, it's very easy to just jump it over into games.
yeah,
Oh, and now we're capturing using engine in movies. Let's put that in a movie. And then let's realize that, like, Wednesdays in Munich, red car, this is not real stats, but Wednesdays in Munich on Wednesday when it's raining sell better than blue cars. Then only render red cars on that day. And so as you're starting to see those pipelines shift, there's massive, massive changes to come into e-commerce in the next year that will be built on these digital twin systems.
yeah,
Last bit of intel I'll give you on that it's interesting. NVIDIA's Omniverse product, which has been around for a bit now. What gets interesting is that's some of the major users of that right now are actually factory systems. BMW uses it for their factory. I think a couple other clothing brands do as well. The idea that their factory exists completely in 3D interactively. And so when you get to this concept that, okay, if my factory exists this way and my entire supply chain exists this way, my e-commerce, my advertising, my design can feed into that entire pipeline. And you start getting to these crazy moments where you're, red paint is cheaper than blue paint or weighs less for shipping. And so we manufacture in the United States. So when we're shipping overseas, it costs more money. So let's not advertise blue cars as much as red cars. Like, you start getting into those sort of stories very quickly where that return rate plummets, but also like a virtualization of your entire pipeline from beginning to end starts playing out. And then it becomes a very quick jump to, like, let's put on a headset and walk the factory floor together. Look at the pipeline, look at that car. Most major supermarkets are already doing this with their end cap systems, where they render their entire store in 3D, and then they put users through the store, and instead of having to build gigantic physical fake stores, they run people in VR through it. And, like, wow, if you put that product on that shelf, it's really not catching, but if it's there, it's better. And if it's next to this thing, it pops even more. That's where we're starting to see this, whether it's in e-commerce or in physical commerce as well.
Hey, this has been great. There was a massive amount of info here, so
This is fun.
I'm excited to get it live. Thanks, Lewis. Thanks for being
Thank
on.
you so much.